dear guests, I think it's time to start. We are still waiting for our discussion, but we will already slowly start with the first presentations. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the seminar of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs titled Competing Visions for International Order. My name is Tyyne Karjalainen and I'm going to serve as your chair today. Today's scholars struggle with an old question: how can we best capture the ongoing change in the international order? New wars erupting, the multilateral system contested on several fronts, the breakdown of the old order is evident, yet it remains unclear what precisely is changing, who is driving that change, and what visions exist for a new order. I have tried to make this sense of this change by revisiting the literature from the 1990s when scholars proposed models to explain the implications of the end of the Cold War for global order. The problem is that if we rely on these outdated ideas of order, we likely fail to grasp what is truly unfolding in our own time. Moreover, the old theories of international order tend to be Eurocentric. And it is clear that if we want to foresee the future order, we can no longer rely solely on European visions. This is why I was extremely excited to learn about this book project, undertaken over the past years by my colleagues Ville Sinkkonen, Veera Laine and Matti Puranen. The editors took on the challenge to update concepts for explaining international order and moreover providing a less Eurocentric vision for global ordering. The book includes 14 visions for international order, including the visions of superpower contenders, the US and China, the status quo powers, including the EU, France, Germany, UK, Japan, and finally, visions from the revisionists and post-Westernizers, India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia. I'm excited that we have all three editors of the book present here today. Ville Sinkkonen, leading researcher here at FIA, Veera Laine, senior researcher at the Finnish MFA, and Matti Puranen, associate professor at the Finnish National Defence University. Additionally, we have two authors of the book here, Toni Alaranta, senior researcher at FIA, and Bart Gaens, also senior researcher here at FIA. Moreover, we will have the privilege of hearing a comment from Teivo Teivainen, professor of world politics at the University of Helsinki. I'm now going to give the floor to Ville, who will provide us with a brief overview of the book's analytical framework and the chapter on the United States. Ville, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tune, and thank you everyone for coming. And on behalf of the editors, I want to thank all of the authors who contributed to this book. Some are in the audience, some are on stage, and we will have various events to celebrate the launch of this book in the coming months, and hopefully all of the authors will feature in some of those events. I'll quickly comment on the concepts and analytical framework of the book. That'll kick us off, and then I'll say a few words about the US vision of international order after that. So the first question, of course, is why should we actually be interested in how key states think about international order at this specific moment in time? And then the technology doesn't work. There we go. So there's actually surprisingly broad agreement in the research and policy community that we're actually on the precipice of an ordering moment. And I think Tune already in her opening remarks commented on some of the key dynamics. And all of these dynamics challenge what is often termed the liberal rules-based order or liberal international order. And in the book, we really play with two key concepts, namely international order and vision. The first of these, international order, we draw on the various debates in international relations. For us, international order has four dimensions. First, a relatively stable distribution of capabilities, which then creates potential power hierarchies. International orders are socially constituted through norms, values, and principles and practices. They contain broadly accepted institutional fora, wherein the different the different actors in the international order interact. And fourth, the orders can vary across space and time. So that's our definition of international order. A vision, in turn, is the ability to think about or plan the future with imagination or wisdom, or a mental image of what the future will or could be like. The visions we discuss in this book, the visions of international order, are actually a subset of political visions. They're about how political communities or their leaderships envisage a future world and the place of their community in that world. Now, these visions are often utopian, but obviously they can also be quite dystopian. But ultimately, the point is that the visionaries in articulating these visions seek legitimacy. They seek it internationally, and they seek it domestically. Now, why have we chosen to focus on visions of international order of key powers specifically? Well, first off, the literature really points to the role of great powers in reordering the world in times of rupture. So their visions can be deemed to matter for the future of international life. These visions are also central to how these key actors in international politics actually construct a great power role for themselves. And they're also linked to the politics of international ordering through this process of legitimation and contestation. And also, which is kind of the key point of the book, by analyzing these visions, we can think about the prospects of a future modus vivendi for international order. Now, in order to explore these visions, we've asked our authors to look at a period of roughly 10 years, from 2014 to the present. And in each of these chapters, the authors analyze authoritative sources. So they can be national security strategies, white papers, speeches, and other public appearances of leaders and key officials, etc. All our chapters are guided by one key question. What are the distributional, normative, institutional, and temporal parameters of the visions that are being put forth by the key powers? Which then allows us, editors, in the conclusion to address two broader questions. Namely, to what extent do these ordering visions of our key powers overlap or are in conflict? And what are the actual implications for the future of international order? And we wanted to give our authors a nice assist, so we produced the following conceptual framework based on our discussion of visions and international order. So we have 4 dimensions that the authors look at, each in different ways in their chapters. In the distributional dimension, we're interested in the desired distribution of capabilities, but also distribution of status or distribution of responsibilities. In the normative dimension, we're interested with the values, ideas, and norms that these powers espouse. In the institutional dimension, we look at the preferred organizational makeup. And in the temporal dimension, we look at the evolution of the vision and its past or future orientation. So that, in short, is the framework for the book. I believe our conclusions will become clear throughout the discussion, at least some of them. So I'll very briefly say something about the United States. In the US, I would argue, there really was a vision of international order, of a US-led order, that informed American global engagement for the first couple of decades of the post-Cold War era. Some call this deep engagement, some call this liberal hegemony, some call it primacy, because the favorite child has many names, but there was a vision. And this vision entailed deterring the rise of hostile regional powers with a global military presence in all key theaters of the world, maintaining an open international economic order, supporting and developing the institutions of the international order and the US's global alliance network, and committing to and promoting liberal democratic norms and values, sometimes more by sword than by word. And this vision has been increasingly challenged on the level of foreign policy elites and the public during the time frame of this book. And this challenge is a function of domestic factors, it's also a function of international factors. And we can come back to these more in the discussion. So my chapter is really the story of a lost vision of a declining hegemon, which is illustrated with the help of the framework that I just laid out for you. I'll say a few words about this. So if we think about the distributional dimension, unlike many other powers that are featured in this book, the US does not directly acknowledge the advent of what others call a multipolar world. What it does acknowledge, especially in the first term and in first term of Donald Trump and then in Biden's term, is the newfound centrality of great powers and a world of great power or strategic competition. And this world could actually only really have come about through the increased influence of others, especially China, as what the US calls a near-peer competitor in the international arena. But there's actually little reflection to suggest that even in this kind of world, the US could not keep leading the way. So there's a certain myopia there. In terms of the normative dimension, the Biden and Obama administration clung to the notion of American liberal democratic values as universalizable. For Biden, the purported contest between great powers was actually about autocracies and democracies. And this even spurred a string of so-called democracy summits. In Trump's first term, these tenets were replaced by other notions like civilization, sovereignty, and patriotism, and a manifestly negative reading of freedom. In the institutional domain, Obama, to a lesser extent Biden, doubled down on multilateralism. For Obama, this was a reaction. It was a reaction to Bush-era unilateralism. For Biden, it was a reaction to Trump's first term and his critical, or some might say transactional, approach to international institutions and to alliances. But even in the Biden era, the US was selective in its multilateral engagement and sought to construct what Jake Sullivan called a lattice work, which consisted also of smaller groupings, such as the G7, the Quad, and the AUKUS. Now, looking at the fourth, or temporal dimension, Obama and Biden both underlined the urgency of seizing a moment when the US still has the resources to lead. Bill Burns, Biden's CIA director, wrote thus, "We're still the pivotal player. We have a window of American preeminence before us in which we can help shape the international order to safeguard our interests and values before others shape it for us." So there is a sense of urgency. For Trump, in turn, the promise of an America made great again harkens back to a glorified past. So what does this ultimately amount to? It amounts to the fact that the US currently lacks a shared vision for the future of international order and its own place in that order. The most obvious common ground, which is great power or a strategic competition, is not really a vision. It's a description of the international arena on the one hand, and it's a prescription to compete on the other. It's a non-vision. There's a profound contestation over the means through which the US should go about engaging in this competition. There's no clear articulation of a preferred end state. Much less is there any critical thinking on how the US and others might coexist in what is a post-great power competition world. What would that kind of a world look like? Now, if we're in a visionless limbo, as I posit, of course this could create the opportunity for articulating a new vision. What remains to be seen is whether the current Trump administration is actually capable of articulating one, at least one that is seen as legitimate. The so-called MAGA ecosystem does offer components of a conservative, anti-globalist approach to the world. But the administration's approach to the world so far has been quite haphazard. It's informed on the one hand by the president's bilateral transactionalism, but there's also a contention over whether the focus on the Western Hemisphere or the Indo-Pacific. And there's also a seesawing between acknowledging great power spheres of influence and actually engaging in great power competition. Some of these tenets that the Trump administration is pushing would certainly be a departure from the post-Cold War vision, but it's just as likely that we're maybe seeing the age of American visionary world-making coming to an end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ville. Maybe just with a few sentences, could you maybe summarize or help us understand, is there some key misunderstandings that we have about the American visions, the US visions for the global order that you kind of correct in this chapter?
I don't know if there's any sort of anything magical in that sense about the chapter or any misconceptions. I think, it's more about how the US is buffeted by these challenges, both globally and internationally, which then creates this kind of, I don't know, economists would use the term hysteresis, where you have an old equilibrium, it gets shattered, and then you hopefully come up with something new. But currently it seems like there is no shared understanding, which is, I mean, obviously following American politics is not particularly surprising.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to follow the 90s thinking and give the floor next to our Russia expert. Veera, if you could continue opening us the kind of vision from Russia for the global order, international order.
Thank you so much, Tune, and thanks everyone for shall I say, invitation, but I would also want to thank all the authors of the book on my behalf as one of the editors. First, I want to make a disclaimer that I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the moment in the strategy unit, but I've participated in this book project on in my sort of individual capacity as a researcher, because it's kind of going further back in time, this project, than my employment at the MFA. But of course, I should probably also state now that I had a co-author writing this chapter with me, and I wish to thank him as well. He's not here, Mihail Komin, who works currently for the Center for European Policy Analysis, and it's a joint effort in that sense. But very briefly, thank you, Ville, for providing the overall framework for the book. I will follow this framework and give brief remarks on how we analyzed Russia's vision of the international order based on this fourfold framework we were using. So, as we all know, Russia's international position, it significantly changed after Russia started its aggression towards Ukraine in 22. But at the same time, its vision for the international order shifted only a little in a way, because what we argue in this chapter, Russia's vision had been gradually developed or crafted during the past 20 or 30 years. And in the 2020s, it actually only became more clear, perhaps, broader in some way, and also more institutionalized and formalized in official strategy documents and official rhetoric of the state and even legislation. And we use in our chapter, as the other chapters as well, the official documents of the Russian state. So first of the normative dimension of the vision, we focused on norms and values, and especially on key concepts of Russia's vision. And I will mention here one of them, which is more like an umbrella term for the others as well. So sovereignty is a key concept in Russia's political language in general, but also in its vision. So I would say that this is Kremlin's conceptual innovation even, that has widened in scope and in range of reference during the past years quite significantly. So the Kremlin does not only speak about political or economic or perhaps cultural sovereignty, but now also about civilizational sovereignty. It clearly covers a lot of aspects of political action for the Kremlin. We know it, of course, we remember how sovereign democracy was one of those conceptual innovations already in the mid-2000s, but this civilizational sovereignty is one of the keys to understand the vision today. In this way, the Kremlin uses the word to describe territorial units, civilizations that have the ability to create and maintain distinct values. And in this regard, Russia is portrayed as the defender of traditional values globally. The civilizational aspect shows also in the concept of state civilization. It's not unique to Russia, and it's not entirely new, but that's one of the key concepts that Russia uses to describe its own activities, but also its own role in the world. And also embedded in this concept of sovereignty, there is this certain blind spot in Russian political rhetoric, which is the sovereignty of others. So in Russia's vision, the sovereignty of Russia's neighbors as well as small states is not really accepted because of the view that these small states or Russia's neighbors, they are not fully independent, they are not capable of producing or maintaining their own distinct value basis. So that's the sort of Russian logic there. And while the rhetoric of civilization grows stronger, then we at the same time see the boundaries of great historical Russia, as the concept goes, expanding further. So this relates to the idea Russia denying the sovereignty of Ukraine and Belarus in particular. Other key concepts, of course, multipolarity is one, and we can discuss that later, as well as from the security policy perspective, Russia's vision for the Eurasian security architecture is covered partly by the concept of indivisible security, which is common to Russia and China. I'll turn to the institutional dimension of the vision. Since 22, Russia has been relying more on bilateral relations, regional formats, as well as its relations to its non-Western partners. We describe this institutional dimension in the chapter having kind of three circles. That's how we organized it. So the first circle closest to Russia would be these regional formats, asymmetric ones, where Russia is the dominating power. Perhaps the Eurasian Economic Union is the clear example of this, or the CSTO. Then the second circle would be those organizations that are more like alternatives to Western structures that promote multipolarity, BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And then the third circle would be reserved for these more like emerging formats or projects such as Russia-Africa summits. And in this institutional setting, of course, it should be mentioned that Russia does acknowledge the legitimacy of the UN. At the same time, it's violating the UN Charter by attacking Ukraine. But then for its vision, the most sort of heavy organization is, of course, the UN Security Council. And I'll mention about the distributional dimension that for Russia, these traditional domains of great power, such as military might, nuclear weapons in particular, vast territory, population, and natural resources, they all are very important, and they figure in all the strategy documents. But besides these characteristics, the idea is very clearly there as well, and explicitly said that leading powers have also earned their status through their actions in the past, and this status aspect is very important for Russia, and explicitly the winners of the Second World War are seen as those who have the sort of right, but also the responsibility in this ordering process. And it also goes a little bit further back in history with the civilizational aspect again coming to the picture. Lastly, I'll mention about the temporality. We actually had very interesting discussions whether a future vision of the international order or any future vision can actually be past-oriented, since Russia is relying heavily on these traditional conservative values in its political rhetoric as well. So could it be said that there is this ideal moment in the already experienced past for Russia? And I would say that yes, this vision is past-oriented, but at the same time it contains an element of future, which is Russia's critique of the Western neocolonialism that aligns with the more future-oriented visions of other players of this fair and just international order. So to conclude, I think Russia envisions itself as one of the influential centers of the world. Perhaps it's also possibly seeking a role where it could be one of the sort of ideological centers. We make the point that perhaps in this Russia-China partnership or this new reality, Russia might see itself as the more like ideational center, whereas China would be providing economic, being this kind of like economic hub, and both would be then seen attractive to the so-called global south or the global majority as Russia calls them. So maybe with this idea of the future, I think I'll conclude and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a super quick question. You didn't mention the OSCE, but if we go back to the 90s literature about the security or the international order or the European order, it's always there when we talk about Russia. Is it completely irrelevant now in their recent thinking?
I don't think it's completely irrelevant, but it's a good question because there's a difference, I think, in what is kind of visioned in the programmatic discourse and what is actually done. And Russia is probably using, of course, all platforms and formats it can, but it's not necessarily visible in the sort of in those projections of the future vision, at least that strongly. But it's true, we didn't write a lot about the OSCE. It's a good point.
I think this indeed sounds like that you have an updated version of the concepts and theories. Now I'm turning to China. I think we all want to hear what you found with regard to the Chinese visions.
Thank you very much, Tune, and thank you all for attending, and thanks also for my co-authors and co-editor for making this thing done finally. My chapter, or not my chapter, I wrote it together with Julie Chen from the University of Helsinki. So our chapter, we were looking at the Chinese vision of an ideal international order. And on that note, everybody who's been thinking about or reading about a Chinese order vision on international order, on how it should be reformed or so on, has probably heard of the term community of shared future for mankind, because this is kind of the term that the Chinese government has been pushing for quite a long time, at least since 2013 or so on. So it's like the official top-level vision for the Chinese government on how the international order should be reformed. But in 2021, Chinese government started to push out also these so-called global initiatives. So in 21 there was the Global Development Initiative, and in 22 there was the Global Security Initiative, and then there has also been a Global Civilization Initiative, and finally this autumn there was a Global Governance Initiative. So those are not really, disbanding the vision, the top-level vision, the community of shared future, but are more like providing details on how it could be achieved. So in our chapter with Julie, we focused on Global Security Initiative, which was published in 2022, basically, or used officially first time, pretty soon after the war in Ukraine started. And yeah, by the way, our chapter, as many other chapters as well in the book, are open access and should be openly readable in the internet. I don't remember which other chapters, but almost half of the book eventually will be open access. So go and take a look. Yeah, so we focus in our chapter into this global security initiative, and if you go through this idea or this vision, this security vision, through the framework that Ville just described on distribution, dimension, institutional, normative, and temporal dimension. If we begin from the power distribution dimension, what is an ideal distribution of capabilities in a Chinese world order or international order? Well, it would be, according to these documents, a quite egalitarian system in which all states, big and small, this is how they use the term, should be equal in relation to each other. So they would not be, they could be great powers, of course, they would not be vanishing anywhere, but basically great powers should be on an equal standing with smaller powers. Right, and there would not be any types of hegemonies in this system. So no great power, whether that be US or China, would be able to kind of push its own vision over the others. And the sovereignty, territorial integrity of all states would be respected according to this idea. So a flat but multipolar system in that sense. Now if you look at the normative dimension then of the Chinese vision, well, I would say that it would be ideologically quite ambivalent. So in the sense that a Chinese vision would not necessarily, or this community of shared future would not necessarily have any universal values that everybody should be accepting within their domestic contexts. So states would be able to choose their own ideas and political systems and values based on their cultural and historical backgrounds. There's a lot of talk about justice and democracy and freedom in this rhetoric, but when China uses these concepts, it's not meant that these are to be understood in the liberal setting that we use them, but they relate to justice between states, justice, democracy between states, or freedom of states to choose. So they're not individual values, but more like values of the whole international systems, I would say. So that would be kind of the normative framework of an ideal international order based on Chinese ideas. And then the institutional dimension. Well, according to the Chinese vision, the Global Security Initiative, current institutional structure would do just fine. I mean, United Nations at the center, United Nations Security Council at the center, General Assembly, all that. Also, the economic institutions that we have at the moment, like the IMF and WTO, they would just continue working as they are still today. They would need to be democratized in the sense that countries from the global south would have more say in them, but they would not be overthrown in place of something completely new. Now, China claims that these old school institutions would be supported by certain new institutions, such as perhaps like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS or anything else, but they would be in a supporting role in the end. So the old core of the international order would not be completely overthrown according to the Chinese vision. Now finally, then the temporal aspects of this order. So in this book we were looking at how have these visions been evolving historically and where are they headed in the future. So if you look at the historical evolution of this vision, it is actually quite old. If you go back to the Chinese old principles, the so-called 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, those were invited in 1950s or something like that. So they are still at the very center of this vision as well. So actually there's not that much anything new about this vision compared to what China has been saying all along for a very long time. It's just that it's currently being pushed at a really, well, not aggressive, but at a loud level, you could say. Now, when would this vision then be realized? There's no any
actual schedule or timetable on that regard. But typically, analysts at least tend to connect the realization of this vision to the realization of China's own set goals, the two centenary goals. So that would be 2049 when the PRC celebrates its 100-year anniversary. Then probably at the same time, maybe this community of shared future would be in place, but it's not official. It's just something that people have been pondering on. But also, there you have it basically, the Chinese vision. Equal, ideologically quite ambivalent, and institutionally more or less the same as we have currently.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating. Can you maybe point just maybe one key point of conflict where this vision is in conflict with what we heard from Ville or Vera?
There could be a lot to be said about that. For example, it is a global security initiative, and the way how they understand security in this vision. Well, we can go into that in a QA. If somebody wants to ask you can ask me about indivisible security according to the Chinese understanding and the legitimate security concerns according to the Chinese understanding. But yes, there's quite a huge paradox embedded in that vision actually, which we can discuss later.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping it short. Now we are going to turn to India. I'm going to give the floor to Bart.
Thanks, Tune. I think that for India, you can say that the world is entering a new paradigm of global affairs, marked by, first of all, China's growing presence, including in India's immediate neighborhood, the retrenchment of American power, and also a world marked by greater multipolarity and uncertainty in international affairs. Just a quote from India's foreign minister, Jay Shankar. He said that the world now looks like a global marketplace with less preconceptions and more transactions. So in that new world, India is certainly displaying a newfound confidence and also ambition to take up what it sees as its rightful place as a rising power in the world order. Doing some interviews in Delhi some time ago, one of the interlocutors said that India is on a geopolitical high. And I think that sums up very well this drive to find its rightful place in the world as a rising power. Now, if I were to summarize India's world ordering visions in terms of the four dimensions of the book here, I would give four key concepts. That's multi-alignment, civilizational state, forum shopping, and future focus. So I'll say a couple of words about each of these. To start with multi-alignment. I think it's fair to say that India is seeking to avoid having to make policy choices between China, Russia, or the United States. To again paraphrase India's foreign minister, he said, basically the world consists of multiple poles. Convergence is possible, but not congruence. It's a world full of frenemies. And in that world, it's quite natural to engage with the US, with China, and with Russia, all at the same time. I think this is something relatively new, especially since Modi came to power in 2014, that this policy of non-alignment has been replaced with multi-level engagement and multi-alignment. So, as Modi said himself, India is actively pursuing a diversity of interests in diverse settings with diverse powers. And this view of this multipolar world is certainly post-Western, and I think that India's identity as a post-colonial state has a strong bearing on that, on this dimension. I wouldn't say that India is anti-Western, rather non-Western, and also certainly post-Western. And this has a strong impact on relations with all the other powers globally, but we can come back to that in the discussion. So secondly, there is the concept of civilizational state. Of course, India is highly diverse in terms of geography, ethnicities, subnational identities. Even as for religion, Hinduism is for 80% the most important religion. But even within Hinduism, there are a multitude of languages, castes, customs, and so on. And that's where then this idea of Hinduness or Hindutva comes into the picture to promote this idea of India as one civilizational state. And of course, India can rightly claim a legacy of 5,000 years of civilization as for knowledge, philosophy, and culture. But I think that during the past decade, there has been quite a shift in that rhetoric from India, and especially during the Nehru era, from India being a civilization to India at present being a civilizational state. When you say civilization, it can mean more like a bridge, a mixture or an amalgamation of cultures. But when you say civilizational state, that means more a singular, exclusive view on a society that seeks homogeneity in spite of being very diverse. And here the new term for India, Bharat, the traditional Hindi name for India, the usage of that term, I think, speaks volumes to this idea of promoting itself as a civilizational state. Third, as for the institutional dimension, forum shopping. In the chapter, I mentioned an American scholar who has criticized India for being promiscuous. So he said, look, okay, this is promiscuity as for institutional affiliations, what India is conducting in foreign policy. But maybe a better term and also more negative, less negative sounding would be forum shopping. So India has a very wide and broad membership in numerous institutions, be it global, regional, or minilateral. So based on this idea of strategic autonomy, India has been very actively shopping as for forums. So during the past decade, we have seen closer alignment with Western aligned groupings, including the Quad. There's the trilateral with Japan and the US, the JAI. There's also the I2U2, India, Israel, US, and UAE, and so on. But at the same time, then, there is the BRICS Plus membership of India. There is also the IPSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that was already mentioned. Then you also have the Russia, India, China gathering, and so on. So India doesn't see any contradictions in this multitude of affiliations in institutions, and this is something that is occasionally misunderstood in the West. And then finally, as for the temporal dimension, India does have a very clear vision. It's labeled Viksit Bharat, which means developed India, and that is the Indian government's long-term vision to transform the country into a fully developed, prosperous, and globally influential nation by 2047, which is the year of India's 100 years of independence. So this is not just a slogan, it's India's national mission, combining economic ambitions with a strong cultural identity, also with domestic implications as for social justice, prosperity, and so on, and also to be globally recognized as an important player. Is this attainable? I would say that India has all the trump cards for the future. As for population, it is now the most populous nation on earth. It's also a very young population that India has. As for economy, India has the fourth largest economy, growing by 6.5% a year. In terms of geopolitics, the fact that we now speak of the Indo-Pacific attests to a growing role of India. Militarily as well, India is extremely strong, spends 2.9% of the GDP on defense, and currently has the fourth most powerful army in the world and the fifth highest defense budget. Of course, India does have still quite a lot of challenges, but at least when it comes to world ordering visions, I think that India has a very clear and long-term mission, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That was really detailed. Now I'm going to turn to the ordering vision of Turkey. Tony, would you like to continue?
Thank you. I could actually start by saying that it's interesting how much similarities there are between India's and Turkey's visions, even though India clearly is at the moment building alliances with Turkey's adversaries such as Greece and Israel, whereas Turkey has sort of a minilateral cooperation with Pakistan and Qatar, so that Pakistan is of course India's adversary. But nevertheless, there are many similarities regarding the visions, and I think this is already an interesting founding regarding the question of how these visions might combine. Regarding Turkey, of course, catchwords are multipolarity and post-Westernism. These are there is an almost endless array of text and discourse in Turkey that uses these words. There's not a single week goes by without the intelligentsia behind the governing body, the Justice and Development Party, the AKP. The intelligentsia produces these narratives about multipolarity and post-Western world on a daily basis, basically. And there is this, my argument is based on the view in this book that you have to combine, make a strong combination of the domestic transformation taking place in Turkey during the last 20 years under Erdogan's era, and then these more systemic structural changes induced by the rise of China and the relative weakening of the West. So this is the combination of these two major changes, the domestic transformation and the system level transformation, that actually produces the basis for Turkish vision. And this is why I have labeled this Turkish vision as a vision of the AKP regime, which would probably today we might call it Erdogan regime, because it has become so highly centralized around the president. One thing that is of crucial importance also in the Turkish context is that this vision is based on the idea that there used to be this kind of tutelage regime in Turkey, and this refers to the old elites, the so-called Kemalists, the so-called westernizers, who in this view illegitimately ruled Turkey for many decades until the AKP came to power. But this tutelage or guardianship also has an international aspect, and that refers to Western powers. And the westernizers within Turkey are the domestic representatives to some extent of the Western powers in Turkey. So there is this double tutelage or guardianship that the current elite is fighting against and sees as something highly problematic for Turkey, and also claims that they have now moved beyond this tutelage. So this is important to keep in mind, the domestic basis of the vision, and then those aspects that are induced by the systemic transformation. There is also a whole new vocabulary, a political language created during the last 20 years, a new kind of conceptual map to define Turkey's place in the world. One could even speak about a paradigm shift, because it used to be the case that Turkey's modernization and its place in the world was highly shaped by the idea that how Turkey reacts to the rise of Europe, to the rise of the West, and how it internalizes these Western institutions and so on. And now this has all almost changed 330 degrees, because the rise of China and other powers now enable Turkey to retell its national story from completely new premises. Some of the catchwords are Also in Turkey, the civilizational state, and this refers to the Ottoman Islamic Empire that ruled Middle East for over 600 years. So there is definitely a strong civilizational element in this discourse. They are also referring to themselves as a leading Muslim power. This is something new, a new kind of state identification that would have been conceived as even pejorative by the previous elite. Then there is this concept of regional central state, claiming that Turkey has this ability and even to some degree a duty to become a regional central state and definitely a middle power, a regional middle power, and that it has this capability of being also an order-producing country in the Middle East. And this, of course, strongly relates to the idea that everything that has taken place in the Middle East during the last 100 years has gone wrong, astray, because of Western powers have been playing their games in the Middle East. And Erdogan refers to these issues on a daily basis. So this is the basis of the vision, and I will now shortly look at the four perspectives. So in temporal terms, one could say that Turkey has moved from adjustment to activism. So I start my account from the early 2000s during the US invasion of Iraq and war on terror. This was an era when Turkey mainly tried to adjust to this new environment in the Middle East, but already at that point, in early 2000s, Ahmet Davutoğlu, who has been this kind of ideological father of Turkey's foreign policy, he published this famous book called Strategic Depth, when he first time introduced all these ideas that I have now referred to, that Turkey has this kind of historical background as an empire in the region, and that it should and could use these cultural and historical elements in order to settle itself as an order-producing country in the Middle East. So from that onwards, from adjustment to activism, and also developing the concept of strategic autonomy, whereas in the West, this is often labeled as strategic ambivalence, but very similar to India. Turkey does not see any contradiction in this. It has a multi-vector foreign policy. It can build strategic alliances with all actors, with all poles, and it's only 3 or 4 weeks ago when Erdogan made this public speech when he referred to Turkey as one of the poles in itself. So there is definitely in their self-identification, there is this kind of conviction that Turkey should play a bigger role. Regarding the distributional element, there is this obvious emphasis on material and military capabilities, and in this sense, it's a very realist and traditional view of distribution regarding the power balance. So obviously, the elite in Turkey also thinks that if you are going to be a powerful actor, you need to have a material basis for it, and especially military capabilities. And this is something that Turkey is definitely trying to achieve and develop its own military industrial complex. It's not there yet, but the desire is clear. But obviously, not only regarding the material capabilities, the Turkish elite also thinks that in order to be a powerful actor, you need to have this kind of civilizational rootedness with accompanying values and some sort of exceptionalism. So not only power, but also the state has to represent some sort of civilizational exceptionalism. Regarding the institutions, I have mainly concentrated on one issue, and that's the reforming of the United Nations and especially the Security Council. So Erdogan has himself even published this kind of pamphlet book where he suggests that the Security Council should be reformed so that instead of 5 members, it should have 20 members, and these should be elected by the General Assembly, so that in this vision, the Security Council would actually become the executive branch of the General Assembly. So this is a very concrete and radical reform attempt. I don't think that this is carved in stone or that Turkey would insist this no matter what. This is more like a opening or a suggestion that something really should be done regarding the Security Council and how the UN works. But this is a concrete example of Turkey's orientation, that it is in this sense definitely a revisionist power, not contending with the present arrangements. And finally, something about the normative issue. I spent quite a lot of time on this in the chapter because obviously the non-Western perspective on these issues is based on the reinterpretation of modernity and modernization itself. So the main argument behind Turkey's stance is that is the idea of plural modernities, and that there are many paths to modernity and development, and not only the one represented by the Western state. And this is, of course, refuting the universalism implied by the liberal international order or the Western-led order. And of course, this includes the idea that there has been this kind of cultural alienation in Turkey, that it was alienated because it tried to imitate the West, and in order to target this, the AKP discourse is full of speech and statements about our civilization, our tradition, and of course, as a populist and conservative party, they tend to think that our tradition, Turkish tradition, is based on religion, family, and Turkish Islamic values and mentality. But I stop it here now, and let's move on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Toni. Dave, I promise I introduced you in length when you were parking your car. So now it's your time to deliver some comments, and then we will turn to the audience so you can already prepare your questions.
Yes, thank you, and apologies for being late. Congratulations to organizers that it was so popular that all parking spots were full. So, yes, I think it's a great book. I read most parts of it, some carefully. Right now, I think the promise, it took me some time to understand that, yes, this is really novel, like looking at these competing visions. And it was written in a way that, you know, from different perspectives of our field, whether you call it world politics or international relations or something else, it kind of makes sense. You know, you can have these more mainstream, you know, soft power used by visions through visions, or you can have more, you know, Gramscian hegemony based, like how to convince others, or more realist based, you know, questions of hegemony, and you need this dimension that is not only about direct material power. So I felt it moved very well in that sense. About hegemony, maybe one question. That now you were also talking about this move from unipolar period, I assume, post-Second World War, until, you know, breakdown of the wall and crumble of the Soviet Union, and then there would be from bipolar to unipolar kind of moment. And I was wondering, like, because you know, this story is not wrong, I'm not saying that, but it's, you know, there are many other stories about, like, for example, that after the Second World War, the world wars, United States was the hegemonic power, which started going down, and you know, 1989 and all that didn't signify that the world suddenly became unipolar, it actually meant that the unipolarity of the US had been in decadence and going down for a while, and the multipolarity started emerging then. Of course, this story sort of downplays the importance of the Soviet Union in hegemonic struggles. So, but overall, as I said, this is just a minor conceptual thing there. I think it showed, and it's useful also here, this, like many mentioned here, the multi-alignment and multipolarity. In that sense, we, perhaps in the media and in Finnish debates and in many other parts, it's like, okay, now this country is moving there, so they're siding with that camp and not this camp anymore. And since authors were very versatile and very learned in their particular let's say national chapters there, it became easier to understand that that's often not the case when you look from the perspective of those countries. Like, we're not trying to side with this camp now that we have something with Russia, something with the United States, or something with China, but trying to sort of place hedge bets in different settings. And I think the book was a nice contribution to that as well. Apart from more, like we heard here, the Security Council vision, part of the ordering visions. Now that Finland has both the stake of trying to enter as a non-permanent member again after the failed attempt last time in the Security Council, and also that foreign policy leadership is proposing reforms of the Security Council, I think this is just one of the dimensions that may have practical importance for Finnish foreign policy sort of making as well. So what are the exact sort of Security Council visions of these different players? Briefly of the chapters we heard about here, Vera and on Russia and that, I don't, since there's so many better Russia experts here than I am. I started thinking about this recently now with this Ukraine so-called peace, whatever proposal that's been around. There was some draft where something that had been dropped away, which was proposing some sort of Christian civilizational alliance between the United States and Russia. And as a minor food for thought, like, and I think it was formulated like against China and sort of, and when you start thinking, Christian nationalism is a term that applies both to the United States and to Russia now, and it may sound a wild vision, like to what extent, if it continued, and of course evangelical Christians are different from Orthodox Christians in Russia, but somehow the idea of sort of Christian nationalism united to the United States, today's governing tendency, and Russia was like, I haven't seen much comparison between these visions since you talked about civilizational and sort of Christian things. I was obviously very happy to just to refer to Bart now and India thing here in as part of advisory council of this FIA here. I've been arguing for a long time, why don't you focus more on India? India is growing, India is so important, and you know, we have so much research on other places, and now I finally see it coming, and it was a great chapter. I'd love to talk more about India. I think you pointed out very nicely these different things. I was happy you referred to this phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is an example of which is used by the right-wing, you know, Modi kind of Hindu nationalist fractions, but it's also used by Gandhian socialists, meaning, you know, the world is one family, and it's kind of this sort of ambiguity when you refer to your own civilizational sort of roots. It can have uses that are politically different also in left-right terms, and India is a good example of that. Now we focus on Hindu nationalism, but some of the terms have been familiar to me for decades from, like, you know, Gandhian circles and all that. So it would be fascinating to explore that more. Also, if at some point Modi government goes out, this sort of RSS, BJP tendency goes out, but still the self-confidence, civilizational self-confidence that you nicely described remains there. So this was also very useful. China chapter, of course, by Matti and Julie. Great great stuff, learning much about it. And I think when now you were talking about democracy, for example, and you said democracy between states in Chinese. I remember this once. It was also FIA organized thing many years ago with Mrs. Ma, Chinese ambassador, and I was like teasing. There were Finnish ambassadors who were saying, yes, in actually Myanmar, yeah, we need democracy, and then the Chinese ambassador, no, we need sovereignty and all that. And then I asked, do you think these Europeans are a little bit there's this complication. They always say we want to promote democracy in individual countries, but not in the global system. And then she would, yes, we Chinese, we are for international democracy. And I convinced her, this is, if the people from Chinese embassy, please, that she would come and talk at the university about Chinese vision on international democracy. Also because someone told me the Chinese never come if you put democracy in the title. I wanted to prove them wrong. So prove me wrong, please. I'll prove them wrong and me right, actually. About Chinese influence now, also, I think you referred nicely to this thing like China and image of China. Of course, Donald Trump plays an important role here. Has become more of sort of maintaining the international order, and it has many dimensions. One of the questions I sometimes ask in the European Union and European diplomats and all that, could this maybe mean that, for example, human rights concerns with China become a little bit less focused on, because in this sort of great game of today, it's important for the European Union to have a sort of relationship with China, so we should focus less on human rights kind of issues that might cause friction in relations with China. Diplomats always say, no way, you are dreaming, you are imagining things. So I would like to ask if you've noted any of this. And of course, climate and future, and I'm just briefly, now of course, Trump has given much room for China in different arenas. I was just in UNESCO General Conference in Samarkand in Uzbekistan, and it was very, very clear. And in climate, how much has China's now, after COP, there's some ambiguity, but somewhat ambitious global climate goals, and the belief that China is, because or despite of its authoritarian system, able to sort of order that, we'll get to these goals, and that sort of heightens China's international status also in the eyes of the Europeans, and also in the eyes of neighbors. Last 11 months, I've been in 7 neighboring countries of China, and in just about all, not India, but all others, there's this thing that, hey, our cities are really, really, really polluted and dirty. Look at China. Look at how clean their cities seem. Everything's running on electricity. Let's send our minister, our mayor, and everybody to China to learn from China about how we could make our cities, whether it's Kathmandu, whether it's Lahore, whether it's Ulaanbaatar, whether it's some Central Asian city, make them clean. So China's sort of convincing power is also increasing recently, I think, through this environmental factor, both on local and on global and on city levels. And how do you see will that continue? All right, Tony's stuff on Turkey, of course, very important. And I think here we've realized Turkey's importance also in Finnish NATO kind of thing, accession. You mentioned about this civilizational question that's apparent in most of the other articles also. One thing I was wondering, and it's maybe I just spent 3 weeks in Central Asia, in countries where most are sort of Turkic, with the Turkic identity is very important. In your text, you emphasize Ottoman Empire as the basis for the civilizational dimension in Turkey's sort of role and future visions of the future. I was wondering if, because not all Turkic countries there in Central Asia were part of Ottoman Empire. So would you? My question is, where's the Turkic the role of the Turkic world, which seemed quite important looking from Central Asian perspective, but is it less important for Turkey's civilizational quest if it's true that it's mostly the Ottoman Empire past and not the Turkic dimension that goes further back in history? So I think Tune is looking at me like, hey, give some room to others. So did I mention everybody's? We could have talked more about Trump and the U.S. chapter, but since I was trying to comment also on your introductory chapter here, so we can leave that for a little bit later. But yes, great book. I was very happy to read it, to learn from it, to realize what great and inspiring research is done here, mostly in the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, which I of course knew from before, but to have another idea, and also in other you said you didn't write this now when in foreign ministry, but congratulations.
So much, Teivo. That was really impressive and fun to listen to. Now I think we can turn to the audience and to your questions. We will have Maya coming in with the microphone, so please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and please introduce yourself and keep it short. And we can also turn back to the speakers. While you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to ask, when I'm thinking about order and kind of what is changing, I'm always interested in where are the centers? Are there some centers? Do these visions have a different understanding? Where are the centers of these different orders? And if there are orders, are there also peripheries? We know that if we look back to the European world order, we always were thinking that the center was in Europe, and looking backwards, we of course were wrong quite often. So that would be really interesting to hear how you see these changing centers and peripheries. Are there any other questions in the audience? If not, then we are going to back directly to the speakers, and we can have another round of your reflections. Also, if you want to answer to some comments that Teivo made. Let's start from Toni this time.
Thank you, Tune, and thank you, Teivo, for maybe I try to answer your question first and then reflect on others as well. Yeah, definitely. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Central Asia definitely became an issue in Turkey. And in the 90s, there was actually this really very strong enthusiasm regarding the Central Asia. There were a lot of talks about the Turkic world extending from the Aegean Sea to the borders of China. Back then, the legacy was twofold. I would say that quite soon it became apparent that Turkey did not have the muscle at the time, not the economic muscle, to compete with Russia in the area. And Russia also quite started to think that this is its own backyard. And on the other hand, China was also increasing its presence there. And on the other hand, the Turkic states, they came up with the feeling that Turkey was trying to play this kind of big brother actor in Central Asia. But of course, they have their organization, which they have now lifted to a more structured form. And I think this is still very important to Turkey because it is they have this cultural kinship leverage that they can use, and they are presenting themselves as a third option for the region's countries, so that they can work with Turkey and balance against Russia and China as well. But of course, this is not dear, so to speak, in the ideological sense to Erdogan, to the degree that the Islamic Ottoman heritage is for Erdogan himself. But of course, everybody in Turkey thinks that these are relatives and that Turkey should play a role in Central Asia, and it does definitely play a role and has played a role, but not to the extent that some of the wider expectations have been, I would say. Do you want to answer the question? Perhaps you can answer David's questions either as well at this point.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for your comments and reading the book. I think regarding the transnational Christian nationalism, I think well, there are studies about this phenomenon, and they go beyond Trump. These connections, and also it's one of those subjects where it's very interesting to follow the money, so to speak, like to see where those kind of resources are also directed, and it's not a one-way street. So there are interests within Russia, obviously, but also within certain circles in the US. And it's not only Russia-US, because you remember for example, the J.D. Vance speech in Munich. So I think it relates to this question, and these connections relate to the sort of bigger picture that when we write about nation states, as we do, for example, in this book, we should be also very sort of careful to remember what kind of visions can be produced simultaneously within one nation state. So there is this element of competition within one political cultural context. So that's one of the questions for future scholars, like how do we approach this kind of visions when there are very deeply conflicting visions within one country, such as the US, for example. Maybe I'll leave it there, but this was one of our sort of one of the crucial questions. Not all actors producing visions are nation states.
Thanks, Teva, for the remarks. First, about the need for India research, I can't agree anymore with you. There is indeed a very big lack of thorough knowledge on India here in Finland, and I've been trying to put in my 2 cents myself, but I'm not, as you know, an India scholar initially. But let's see, hopefully the situation will improve by 2047, when India, aspiring at least, will be a fully developed nation. The concept of the world is one family. I also found that one very interesting, because when I saw it for the first time, I thought, okay, I got these connotations of harmony and a well-functioning unit, but that's not how India sees it. India sees it as, okay, you're born in a family and you have to get along. And of course, you don't get along all the time. There are tensions, there is struggle. So that's the way that India defined the family in this concept. And also it's interesting that they use it as an alternative to order, because for India, the use of the term order is out of fashion, is out of date even. The world simply does not consist anymore of one strictly hierarchically ordered system. Instead, it's issue-based. It's very functional. And what you said about center, I thought was very good. There is no center. The center depends on the issue and the issue at hand, depending on the unilateral, for example, context that you are in. And this is something that I think many in the West are still grappling to understand. And maybe the best example is Trump, when he saw the picture of Modi and Xi, was it in Tianjin on the occasion of the Shanghai and Putin, not to forget, on the occasion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's summit, he said immediately on social media, okay, now India has gone to the dark side. It is now in the camp of deep, dark China, I think he said. But of course, that's totally not the way India thinks. For India, there is no such thing as a clear order, and India will cooperate with any partner, depending on their own national interest.
Extremely interesting. Now I'm turning to Ville and then Matti.
First off, Teivo, thank you so much for your kind words on the book and also for engaging with the book on so many different levels. Now, on hegemony and the hegemony story that we perhaps have in the book, we are really zeroed in on the current order and the challenges for the current order. And of course, if you read some of the canon on this concept, I mean, the John Eikenberry argument, I guess, is that the liberal international order had its best run during the bipolar Cold War era because it was the order of the West. And then when it became a global order, sort of the only game in town for that very brief moment after the end of the Cold War, then all of these frictions and challenges that were sort of built into the order initially, also in terms of the different hierarchies that were built into it, actually became more apparent and more challenged. So I guess this is what we were aiming at. But I sort of, on a sort of material level, I agree with your analysis of how sort of, if you look at the sort of longer reach of history, that this sort of golden age of U.S. hegemony might not have been at the end of the Cold War and instead at the end of the Second World War. Tune's question about the centers and peripheries actually is extremely interesting, because for the United States, clearly the center is shifting. And the center is shifting from the transatlantic world to the Indo-Pacific world. At least if you listen to the first Biden administration, no, the first Trump administration rather, the Biden administration, also the sort of tail end of the Obama administration. But the current Trump administration is an interesting anomaly. That we're getting a situation where some are clearly pushing for this kind of Indo-Pacific understanding of the future of America's global engagement. But then you have a sort of restraint wing that is pushing for a return to the Western Hemisphere in quite a muscular manner, might one say. So it's an interesting situation for the United States in that sense as well, if one thinks of its sort of world ordering vision, but certainly for the U.S. at least, the center is shifting. It's not a transatlantic world anymore. It's something else, and Europe is becoming more and more peripheral for the United States, which is something that we in Europe should keep in mind. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Teivo, from me as well on your comments and kind words. On international democracy, yes, that is. I think strikingly important part of the Chinese vision. That, yeah, they talk about democracy, but only at state-to-state level of debate. So they are not pushing their people's democracy or the liberal version of democracy anywhere. Every state should be able to choose its own political system and set of values. That's how it goes in the Chinese vision. So I was reading actually Immanuel Kant's good old book called the Perpetual Peace, and if you look at the order that he envisions in that book, which is this federation of free republics, then the community of shared future for mankind, it's almost like that, with the exception of the word free. So federation of republics maybe, or states, is quite close, which would be able to kind of deal with their domestic issues themselves and decide on their own policies. And just like the Kant's vision, I think Kant was saying that if we are ever to build a global state, like a global federation, it should not have anybody or any actor in a decisive position, because then we end up in a global tyranny. So we can only have a federation of more or less independent states, not free in the Chinese version, but still that's kind of the idea. I think so, surprisingly close to a Kantian vision that China is at least rhetorically pushing at the moment. The reality is, of course, could be something completely different. Is EU toning down its human rights rhetorics vis-a-vis China currently? I don't sure. This is not something that I really follow, so I don't have any data on this. There's probably some some experts on the audience who have a better picture than I. But there are still some cases within the last few years or something in which the union or some individual states have been kind of even quite loudly be pushing certain hard spots on China's human rights records when it comes to Xinjiang or Hong Kong. So at least there's something, but I really don't know the big picture. This is not something that I look after that much. But yeah.
Thank you so much. If there are still no questions from the audience, we have one. Please.
Thank you. I'm Sarja Rohavre, and I'm a senior advisor on geopolitics for Business Finland and associate fellow for RUSI, Royal United Services Institute in London on China's foreign policy. My question is maybe primary for Ville, but it's about that order is usually backed by some certain power metrics. And in 2017, Vladimir Putin said that the country that leads AI will lead the world. It's likely not going to be Russia, it's going to be China or the US. So, and at the same time, like deep tech and critical technologies, they are kind of a source of power, but at the same time, they are also a very important economic driver for power. So did you talk about such capabilities that they play a role in this equation? And what kind of a role, where did you end up? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There will be another question, 2 other questions on that side, please. We can take both. And
Yes, my name is Peter Paul. I'm with the University of Helsinki, where I'm an associate professor of international relations. Thank you very much for enlightening and very interesting discussions, but I was missing a few things. You're not talking at all about the regional hegemons like in Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, and some other major countries, or Latin America, where you have Brazil and Mexico and some other very important nations. So I was missing this discussion altogether. And I think, and I really don't believe that you can push a policy from China or United States or for Europe on another country. Every country develops its own policies and its own interests. And then the trend, which I would like to have comments on, is that I have the feeling, and not more than the feeling, that the United States is pushing its international responsibility. If we look at the Ukrainian case, it's pushing it to Russia and to Europe. You take care of the problem. If we're talking about Taiwan, the recent discussions in the press, at least, is that China can take care of it and we don't want war. So in other words, the United States is washing its hand and going back into a kind of neo-Monroean policy with the actions in Latin America, Venezuela, and so on. So I think that these things should have been discussed in the book, and I was missing them. And as a final reflection, I think you still, even though you said on the contrary, I think the whole book has a very European perspective. Thank you.
Thank you for the insights. My name is Eero Salokorpi. I'm just wrapping up my internship at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs at the Unit for Climate Diplomacy. And in relation to this and what Teivo briefly mentioned, I'd love to hear your thoughts, considering the just ended COP30 in Brazil, with the US announcing their withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and with China with their massive investments in green technology, with critical minerals. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. How does the country of your emphasis see the response to climate change in relation to the international order and their visions on it? Thank you.
thank you so much for these questions. I'll add 2.
if we look back to the literature on international or order or European order, security order back in the 90s, quite many of the scholars would suggest either a logic of conflict or a logic of cooperation dominating in this order. That could be also the logic of anarchy or the logic of international society. So do you see elements of this kind of thinking in these visions? And is one of these two logics dominating in the visions? Or is this kind of thinking completely outdated now? This kind of dualism maybe between conflict and cooperation. And then another question, since we are in Finland, what is the status of small states in these visions? What will be the role of states like Finland or perhaps other small states in the European Union in these visions for global order or international order? Maybe this time we'd start with Matti and then go that way.
Well, thanks. A lot to unpack in there. First of all, on the chapters of the book, we actually have chapters on Brazil, South Africa, Iran, what else? So for this panel, we weren't able to get all of those authors to discuss, but I think it at least tries to include some diversity in that regard, regional diversity. So you mentioned like regional central states, so we try to include as much as we could. But onto the questions. On climate, well, had to say, this is not something that I follow. I'm from the National Defense University, so I count tanks and stuff like that. And this chapter also, we were looking at the Global Security Initiative, and I don't recall that the climate part is plays a prominent part in that initiative. So really can't comment on that, at least based on what I've been reading lately. But of course, I mean, if you read other papers by China, then environment is constantly, heavily emphasized. I know the global warming and fighting against global warming at an international or global level is always emphasized, not necessarily in the Global Security Initiative, which was the topic of this chapter. And then anarchy. What does the Chinese vision say about anarchy? Anarchy is well, all of the Chinese global visions or international visions, they basically make this argument that peace and development are kind of the trends that cannot be overthrown anymore, that the global system is developing toward a more peaceful and economically developed stage, and this trend cannot be overturned. So anarchy and the kind of law of the jungle type of international systems, they belong to the past, and we're kind of trying to move beyond them as we go. There are some certain countries that are still haunted by Cold War mentality and stuff like that, but eventually they will wither away, and a Kantian future where anarchy is a remnant of the past will be materialized. And small states, well, as I mentioned in the beginning when I was discussing the distribution dimension of the Chinese vision, according to the Chinese vision, small states should be equal between bigger states. So there would be no classification basically between small and larger states, according to the rhetorics. The bigger states would have more responsibilities regarding the global system, but they would have no exceptional powers regarding the smaller states. Now keep in mind that everything I've been saying about the Chinese vision up to this point is completely based on rhetorics. So I mean, the actual order building and actual conduct could be something completely different. But let's not go there.
Okay, thank you for the audience questions. I suppose Sari's question was directed at me, so I'll start with that. There is a role for technology, obviously, in terms of capabilities building in the US vision, and it is central. I think that's the simple question. So they do realize that as part of this great power competition, obviously strategic technologies play a key role in who will come out on top. And in a sort of, and this is actually the case for both the first Trump and the Biden administration. So if you read the policy documents, then clearly they do do realize the centrality of this challenge, and they also pursue policies to that end, on which we've actually got another research project at FIA that I'm involved in. So looking forward to continuing these discussions. What's missing from the book in terms of regional hegemons, I guess Matti sort of answered that question. I'll say something about the sort of neo-Monroean turn of the United States, which has become more visible, I suppose, in the second Trump administration. Right around the time when this book was finished. There's a bit of a discussion on that at the end of the US chapter. And I tried to allude to that also in my remarks in terms of sort of where the US is going in terms of burden shedding as opposed to burden sharing. And that's obviously part of the kind of visionless limbo that the United States currently is in. So it does not want to shoulder these international responsibilities. Less so in the Trump term. I mean, in terms of what the sort of Democrats versus Republicans think about international order, there's obviously a bigger cleavage now than there has been for a long time. But it's not that simple within Trump's own ecosystem either. I'll say something about the conflict cooperation dynamic. Climate. In terms of climate, I mean, obviously in the US, the answer is pretty simple. I mean, the Biden administration was concerned about these questions, the Trump administration not so much. There's a middle ground, I suppose, between conflict and cooperation, and that would be competition. And that, I suppose, would be the sort of the outcome looking at sort of my chapter in the book, that this is sort of, it could also be a multi-order world, sort of drawing from Trina Flockhart's work. The future could be a multi-order world. And these different orders, whether they're regional, whether they're somehow sort of ideologically tied together, because of course the relevance of space is different now than it was 20 or 50 or 100 years ago. So it could very well be that we're in a world where these different orders sort of coexist, clash, emerge at different stages in different contexts. So it's a messier world than the world of the 90s, at least the world of the 90s on the pages of IR books. So I guess that's and I hope somebody else still has time to say something.
Thanks. I'm not a specialist on India's climate policy, so I'm probably not going to comment too much on that. Obviously, India has a massive problem with pollution as well as the impact of climate change in the country, but I have the feeling that for now, at least, they are giving priority to the domestic developments and prioritizing the immediate needs of the population in terms of social issues and more equality. The logic of conflict and cooperation, I think, and then linking that with the remark about small states, maybe not small states, but middle powers. I think India is very active in trying to promote cooperation with other middle powers, and can give the example of the EU and Japan in particular. There has been this year quite a lot of progress on the EU-India FTA. Suddenly, it was dormant for over a decade, I guess, and now because of especially because of the Trump administration in the US, Europe is, actually putting actions to its words, and they are now closing on the signing or of the ending of the negotiations by the end of this year. Cooperation with the EU also, by the way, includes climate partnerships as well as cooperation on renewable energy, for example. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on there. With Japan as well, I think Japan is one of India's most important partners, not least in South Asia. The most recent summit between Japan and India had quite a lot of tangible outcomes. There were agreements on cooperation on economic security, on human resource exchanges, on cooperation in Africa for sustainable development in African development, and so on. So at least when it comes to cooperation with other middle powers, I think India has been extremely active.
Thank you. I'll just very briefly mention that regarding climate, that yes, we all know how dependent Russia is on fossil energy, so that affects the vision. So Russia's economy cannot be built in other ways, at least for the time being. But then on a more general level, I think this is at least one of the sort of underlying motivations as well, because for the whole project, I mean, because at some point we were still discussing this tragedy of the competing visions, and it's not in the title of this book anymore, but it kind of relates to the more general and very burning issue that how do we then continue working together globally with those challenges that are common to all of us if we cannot find even the very sort of most basic concepts, or we cannot agree upon the very basic concepts mentioned here today. So I think it's a fundamental issue, and it's also a fundamental question for future studies on this topic. But I will probably limit myself there. I'll just mention about the Eurocentric point. Yes, we did our best, but of course we recognized the problem. One thing I'll mention is that it was interesting to discuss amongst ourselves that which powers, it's not perhaps surprising that those who we see as the challengers of the status quo, they seemed also to be most ready, most eager, and most sort of comprehensive in their envisioning of the international order. So maybe this volume also functions as a reminder that also us in the West, we need to be able to produce and imagine better visions for the international order. So maybe that's like one more like a philosophical point I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Okay, shortly, few words regarding the perspective, the overall perspective regarding Eurocentrism. Of course, this is an issue that the whole discipline is trying to tackle on regarding international relations. There is this ongoing debate how that could be made as a discipline, a more international, more global. That's an ongoing process, of course. We had, regarding the regional hegemons or regional actors, speaking of my own field, we had three states from the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And this analysis is based on the official documents and discourses produced in those countries by the actors themselves. So that was at least an attempt to deal with this issue. I also hint at that the liberal international order concept as such is problematic. There is, of course, the argument can be made that it is a rhetorical construct as well. But the same can be said about multipolarity. It is also, we can also see it as a concept that says something about the reality out there, but it is also a construct used by the actors to push onwards with their own agenda, just as much as the liberal international order has been used to justify the current order, which has of course benefited the Western states. So I think these things are included to some degree, but of course the focus was on these vision narratives. Regarding climate change, in Turkey's case, I think this climate change and environmental issues are very domestically very contested issues. The Turkish regime it's kind of state capitalism or crony capitalism that has not given much attention to environmental issues, and this is of course something that the opposition forces are against up in Turkey. Regarding on the international level, this is part of how they see it. This is the part of that the old order, which they see as a disorder, is collapsing, and the new order hasn't arisen yet. So all of these more really truly global issues cannot be addressed at the moment, and they see this as a problem, but not really providing any answers to that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I heard from one of the editors that the order for this panel is that we can have 1 more minute, so we can give Teivo an opportunity to add one point to the discussion.
Thank you. Yes. Well, there was this question about small states, and maybe Finland is one example. Like, what does this all imply? And I don't have that much time, but I was thinking, like, when we talk about past, visions of the past, of course, here we understand it makes a difference whether Russians' imagination of the past is about the USSR or the empire before that, and how that is seen in China. You know, some areas within and without may have similar thoughts. But maybe about the United States now, because it's, for a small state like Finland, one of the most relevant things. Now we are more allied than ever with the country whose ordering vision seems to be more distant than ever from ours. So how to deal with that dilemma? For example, in UNESCO, where I was now, I'm chairing Finland's National UNESCO Commission. So there was this thing, like, in recent, sometimes I ask people, they go to a seminar and there's some talk about gender language needs to be changed. And I asked, was it Saudi Arabia in the room that was insisting on that, or some other country? No, it was Saudi Arabia was there, but they were not the conservative guys. The United States was. So now that United States left UNESCO for practical effects, they are officially leaving end of next year, it seemed that the Nordic ideals that the Nordic coordination was aiming at in UNESCO, they were much easier to attain when the United States was not there wrecking, agreements that include terms like gender. So it's a funny. Then again, one could have the temptation to say, like South Africa's president just said a couple of days ago, like, okay, United States didn't come to G20, all right, now we can, deal with reasonable people without the United States, just stay out. And then at the same time, if the US stays out of these institutions, what does that mean for the possibilities to function and future of these institutions? So these are huge dilemmas, and it's interesting that the United States role now, and which is probably the most relevant one for Finland apart from Russia, is changing so much. But thank you again for the book, and sorry for extending my minute.
Thank you so much, Teivo. I think this panel has been extremely interesting, and at least I'm going to finish reading the book. I want to thank all the panelists, and thank you all for coming to and joining this discussion. So this panel is now closed, and please join me thanking the speakers.